everybody. Welcome to this evening's Community University Forum on Ethics, sponsored by the University of Montana's Practical Ethics Center. This forum is part of a series intended to bring the university and the community together to deliberate about ethical issues that are important to all of us. My name is Mark Hansen. I'm Associate Director at the Ethics Center and soon to be Interim Director, and I'll be the moderator for this evening's forum. The title of which is War and Terrorism in the 21st Century, How We Can Deal with Those Ready to Die for a Cause. And we are very, very grateful to have you here today and to have a distinguished panel of speakers to consider this topic with you. Our format for the evening is going to be as follows. We'll have our keynote speaker speak for about 15 minutes, followed by the other two panelists speaking for about 10 minutes. And then we will have a response time of about 30 minutes when we will be having the panelists respond to each other, and we will be able to respond to your written questions on the 3x5 cards. If you don't have a card, just raise your hand and we can get those to you. And if you have a question that you want to pass on to the panelists, you can write it down on a card and wave it or pass it to the end. And we have a couple of runners who will bring it down to present to the panelists. So please try to make them legible and concise, and we'll get to as many as we can. We'll also time allows for a brief period of direct conversation with the panelists. It's a small enough group tonight that we should be able to accommodate that pretty easily. So I want to also thank our runners for this evening, students Justin Winokur, Lauren Meyer, and also Assistant Dean Ritz, who are all studying philosophy and ethics. And so I will introduce our speakers for all three and then turn it over to them for their remarks. Speaking first will be Dr. Al Pierce. Dr. Pierce was appointed as the first director of the Center for the Study of Professional Military Ethics at the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Has a distinguished record. Prior to that, he'd been professor of military strategy at the National War College in Washington, D.C., where he's taught courses on military strategy and the use of military force, civil military relations, ethics, national security policy, and national security policy making. Prior to joining the War College faculties, he was a defense correspondent for NBC News. He's been deputy director of the Strategic Concepts Development Center, an in-house think tank that was established by former Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger. He's served as assistant to the Secretary of Defense, written speeches, given congressional testimony. I could certainly go on and on about his involvement in those types of activities. He's also been a visiting professor at George Washington University, at the University of Virginia and UCLA's Washington program, teaching about ethics and national security policy. Has numerous publications to his credit, numerous distinguished addresses. He's a graduate of Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., holds master's and doctorates in political science from Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts. Following Dr. Pierce will be our own Professor Richard Drake. He's a professor here at the University of Montana in the Department of History. Certainly known as a distinguished scholar, receiving an award for that in 1996. Also has received awards for his inspirational teaching capacities. He has a PhD from UCLA and teaches in the area of emphasis in modern Italy, modern European culture and thought, contemporary Europe, terrorism, historiography. Also has numerous publications to his credit, and is currently working on a book on the Marxist revolutionary tradition in Italy, for which he has received a National Endowment for Humanities grant. Finally, and certainly not least, is our own director of the Practical Ethics Center, Denny Elliott. Also, she is university professor of ethics, teaches as a professor of philosophy and an adjunct professor at the School of Journalism, has degrees, doctorate from Harvard University, also Wayne State and University of Maryland, She's written and done research on a variety of issues in practical ethics, ranging from journalism and human-animal studies and bioethics to international politics, with many publications as well, to her distinguished credit. She also helped establish here the nation's first graduate degree program in teaching ethics, of which we're extremely proud here at the university. And sadly will be commuting to the University of South Florida, where she will be assuming a position in January as an endowed chair in ethics and journalism. So we're happy to have her joining us here in her probably last official appearance as a faculty member here at the university. Should be a lively discussion, and I will turn it over now for Dr. Pierce.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, Denny, for inviting me here. I've had a great visit. I came with a cold. It got worse while I'm here, so I will, as advertised, talk for 15 minutes or until I run out of voice, whichever comes first. The topic, War and Terrorism in the 21st Century, how we can deal with those ready to die for a cause. First point I want to make is that there is nothing new about people willing to die for a cause. That the history of warfare is the history of soldiers willing to die for a cause. Whether that cause is city-state, or nation-state, or religion, or some other cause, that has been the sad history of warfare. The more traditional category of people who are willing to die for a cause are soldiers. Those who wear uniforms are part of an organized armed force of their nation. But we should never forget that there are other people who have been willing to die for causes, more non-traditional. For example, resistance fighters. Earlier today in the earlier session, I referred to young resistance fighters in France, 14, 15, 16 years old, not soldiers, who made great sacrifices and were willing to die for a cause. So there's nothing unprecedented about what we're dealing with in terms of the basic essence of someone willing to die for a cause. Second point I want to make is I think it's worth thinking about and distinguishing at least two kinds of people we confront today who are willing to die for a cause. The first are those who are fully committed, fully trained, if you will, professionals, even if they aren't soldiers in an organized armed force. So I would include here Al-Qaeda, what we find today, some of the remnants of the Saddam Hussein regime. They are fully trained, fully committed professionals willing to die for a cause. We also find, though, some non-traditional volunteers, those who are not well trained, often including youth. People much younger than we would like to think would be willing to sacrifice themselves. If the committed, fully trained are an inner circle, the larger next circle is the non-traditional volunteers who are willing to do this, often with only very cursory and inadequate training. And then there's a larger circle, the third circle, that I think we need to think about from time to time, and that is the recruiting pool from which the other two circles draw candidates. My preference, and I think the preference of many people in dealing with today those who are willing to die for a cause, would be to be able to deter such attacks. Sadly, however, I think that deterrence basically doesn't work with most of those people. I cut my eye teeth in the national security business, both in academia and in government, in deterrence theory, nuclear strategy, so on and so forth. And the model that we had during the Cold War of the U.S. ability to deter the Soviet Union from attacking was predicated on a reality that no matter how successful their first attack, they could not avoid unacceptable damage that we could inflict on them in retaliation. What made that possible was not only the existence of nuclear weapons, but the existence in the Soviet Union of large-scale targets that they valued highly, armed forces, leadership targets, infrastructure. I think the reason that classic deterrence doesn't work well with the kinds of people we're talking about tonight is for two reasons. First, they have very little that they value highly that we can threaten to retaliate against. There really is no analog to the state of affairs with the Soviet Union. And second, for many of those attackers, particularly those in that middle circle, or the center circle, but even some of those in the middle circle, there's really no way we can threaten to punish them that would outweigh what they perceive as the gains to them and their cause of dying as a combatant in a war against the great Satan. So the logic of traditional deterrence theory, I find, does not fit the kinds of people we're talking about tonight. If we cannot deter them, then where does that leave us? I think it leaves us, first of all, with no silver bullet. There's no single answer to the question, how do we deal with those ready to die for a cause today? All of us who do these kinds of talks come up from time to time with devices, and my device for the evening is, my formula is the 5 Ds. Defend, defeat, deny, delegitimize, and dissuade. It doesn't make for a very great bumper sticker, but I'll try to walk through each of those and talk you through my thoughts on how each of those 5 Ds is necessary if we are try to come to grips in an important, realistic way with the challenge posed by those who are ready to die for a cause. First, defend. The most solemn obligation of any government is to protect its territory and population, its citizens, and its soldiers as best it can from hostile attack. No defense will ever be perfect at any level. And on the level of sort of individual targets and individual people willing to die for a cause, I keep coming back to a quote from John F. Kennedy during his very short presidency, in which he said at one point, rather presciently as a matter of fact, that anyone who is willing to trade his life for mine can do so. So a fundamental reality about defense is there is no perfect defense. We are in the doing as best as we can business. One option of just riding it out and assuming that we will succumb to these attacks periodically, intermittently, and not doing very much to defend, I think, is an unacceptable, unviable alternative, either politically or ethically. Politically, any political leader who decided to just ride out this threat would be impeached, if not driven out of town by an angry mob. And I think ethically, a government that refuses to perform the basic function of trying as best it can to defend the territory and population and its soldiers is a government that doesn't warrant our legitimate support. So the government must make a serious, reasonable effort against what is largely an unprecedented challenge for us, that is, foreign terrorists trying to strike here at home. That means that we have to focus in on some combination of the most likely and the most feasible threats to deal with, since we cannot defend perfectly against the full range of possible threats. There's much more art than science in this first D, defend. Second D, defeat. I think we have to simultaneously defeat those committed, fully trained al-Qaeda operatives and other members of their apparatus and their counterparts, the residue of the Saddam Hussein regime, for example, when and where we can find them. And those qualifiers are important. We probably cannot defeat them in an absolute sense, but we can defeat them when and where we find them. Those are the people in that innermost circle. This will involve, I think, a combination of war and law enforcement. In some cases, we will destroy them with military forces. In some cases, we will find them, arrest them, and prosecute them. But much of this inevitably will involve blowing up things and killing people, which is what armed forces are organized, trained, and equipped to do and what they do best. An inevitable part of this will be blowing up things and killing people if we're going to pursue the second D, defeat. The third D, deny. And by this I mean deny our adversaries the victory they seek as best we can. There are many ways, I think, for this enemy to win. Let me focus on 2 of them, both of which have, I think, enormous strategic and ethical implications. First way this enemy or adversary can win is if the terrorists literally terrorize us into changing in radical, fundamental ways how we live. If they drive us through terror and fear into stopping going about our day-to-day life, they win in an important sense. I saw a reference in an article recently, I don't know how accurate it is, but it had the ring of plausibility, that said one of the techniques the Israelis use is when a bus is blown up, for example, by a suicide bomber. Whenever feasible and as quickly as possible, the Israelis put that bus back into service. To make the point that not only can they not get buses out of service, they can't even get that bus out of service. That's a way to deny the adversary the victory they seek. So we need, I think, to go about our business, which means, as many of us do, flying on airplanes, which 2 years ago, a lot of people who are flying on airplanes today swore they would never fly on an airplane again. Thank goodness we do that. We need to fly on airplanes, we need to go shopping, we need to go to marketplaces, we need to go to malls, we need to go to office buildings. We need to go about our daily life and thus deny them one sense of the victory that they seek. The answer here is determination. Our determination to deny them that level of victory. Second way that the enemy can win is if they drive us to abandon our ethical principles and our standards. Probably the best example of this is what's happening in Iraq today, where there are attempts being made, conscious attempts, I am persuaded, to get our soldiers to blur the combatant-non-combatant distinction, to react overwhelmingly, and to kill a lot of non-combatants in the process. If they drive us to do that, that's a victory for them. If they get us to attack non-combatants the way they attack non-combatants, that's a victory. And there is a recurring theme in the history of warfare here, where it is often in the advantage of the weaker side to get the stronger side to blur the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, and that is especially true and an especially powerful device in a war for the hearts and minds of the people. Because we can't win the hearts and minds of the people if we blur the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. The answer here for us is discipline. Discipline for our troops to restrain themselves from overreacting, from responding the way the provokers want them to. The fourth D is delegitimize. And this, it seems to me, needs to occur on two levels. One is the international level. We need to delegitimize terror as an acceptable tactic or technique. The best analogy I can think of from history is piracy, the way the international community treated piracy. And we basically made clear collectively in our own stumbling way that it was unacceptable to commit piracy and it was unacceptable to tolerate pirates or to support those who committed piracy. And there are some useful lessons, I think, to learn from the 19th century experience on piracy as we deal with terrorism today. The second level on which it can be delegitimized, there's very little that we can do. And I think this level of delegitimization has to come from within Islam. That is, I think the moderate voices of Islam need to preach more loudly and more often and more clearly than they have what I understand from their teaching. First of all, that Osama bin Laden and others have perverted the sense of jihad. Second, that Islam maintains a respect for non-combatants that the terrorists seem to ignore. And third, so I am told, that Islam and the Quran condemn suicide. It's not going to help delegitimize that if that sermon comes from non-Muslims. We have to rely on the Muslim world to preach Islam to their fellow Muslims. This would help us reach that middle circle, the people who are sort of loosely trained, roughly amateurs, but are somehow driven to make a contribution here. The fifth D is to dissuade. And here I think we're in the business of that outer circle, not the people who are fully trained, committed professionals, not the amateurs who are loosely trained but who commit these acts, but that wider circle from which they recruit. And here I think we have to dissuade them from attitudes that are hostile to us. And then, as the next step, dissuade them from behavior that is threatening to us. Now this is the most remote and the most difficult to do. This is really the realm of policy and public diplomacy. It is a long-term, step-by-step effort to do this. In summary, I think the best that we can do is some combination of all five of those Ds. My own view is that we ignore any one of those Ds at our peril. And the art is in finding the right balance among the five Ds. But my formula tells me, at least, as I'm about to run out of voice, that all five Ds are essential ingredients to making this work. Thank you.
I had been given permission to wonder And so I'm going to rise at this point and come up among you, if I may. I hope you can hear me all right back there. Well, I'm the sixth D, Drake. And I'd like to present some ideas about terrorism from my discipline, which is history, and how to combat these individuals who are willing to die for a cause. I think that historians have some interesting directions for us, interesting suggestions for us, and particularly in our time, as the world is increasingly bloodied by these suicide bombers that Dr. Pierce mentioned. We need to search for answers to this problem wherever we can, and ethics, of course, is a very important field, but I think so is historiography. I teach a course on historiography here. And in my course, which I'm doing this semester, we read the chronicle of Jean of Joinville, a medieval chronicler who actually went on crusade with the Crusaders in the 13th century, and then came back and wrote a book about it. And the most interesting feature of his book for us today is what he has to say about the Assassins, which was a 13th century terrorist group inspired by radical Islam. So when Dr. Pierce tells us that, quoting really from Ecclesiastes, that there is nothing new under the sun, we can well believe him. This is completely true. We've had these problems throughout history, and Joinville's analysis of these radical Islamic terrorists who were inspired by religious fervor, who believed that because they did not fear death, that they would wear those crusaders down. It took them 2 centuries to do it, but they did eventually win and expel them. So history is not entirely comforting when we turn to its pages and seek lessons about terrorism. There are instances, and unfortunately many of them, where terrorism is victorious. Terrorism can be a very effective weapon. Now, one of the things I think it's most important to stress as we deal with our subject here tonight is that although in our time the problem of suicide bombers is almost exclusively a problem of radical Islam, throughout history, many other traditions have been responsible. Many other ideological, religious traditions have been responsible for this kind of activity. So homicidal, violent fanaticism is not, I would urge you to consider, a uniquely Islamic problem at all. In fact, in my terrorism course, which Mark mentioned, we spend a lot of time in there talking about various episodes of terrorism from the French Revolution on. And many of the assassins we study in that course undertook their missions fully conscious of the likelihood that they were going to be killed as a result of what they were going to do. Charlotte Corday, one of the figures we deal with, a reactionary Catholic who assassinated Marat during the French Revolution, would be one example of this. Friedrich Adler, a communist terrorist who murdered the Austrian prime minister during World War I, Count Karl von Sturck. Leon Czolgosz, the anarchist assassin, the person who shot and killed President McKinley in 1901. All of these individuals, and there are many, many others, were individuals willing to die for what to them was a holy cause. In fact, as we consider modern history, Western history, leave the Islamic people out of this discussion for just a moment. But as we consider modern history, so pervasive has been the problem of violent fanaticism, politicized violence, that our literature is filled with examples of important books written by our major novelists, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Joseph Conrad, Henry James, have all written books trying to explain something about the reasons why people turn to this kind of violent fanaticism. I think the first attempt to write about a psychological portrait of violent fanaticism appeared in 1864. It's the first book I know of in which an author, Lucien de la Rode, a Frenchman, sat down, wrote a book entitled The History of Secret Societies. He began his book by saying, I do not have a PhD from the Sorbonne, but I've been a police chief in Paris for 20 years. I know something about violent fanatics. This is the high tide, by the way, of violent anarchist activity in Europe. The middle and second third of the 19th century. So he had plenty of experience in dealing with these violent fanatics. He said, what is it that these individuals have in common? And he said this. He said that many of them are extremely smart and extremely well educated. But all the ones I've dealt with in my 20 years down there at the station, these violent anarchists, most of them, in all of my experience, they all suffer from reality loss. That is to say, they have this infinite capacity for make-believe. And that the world, the utopian worlds that they create, are more real to them than the worlds you and I inhabit. So he argued that although many of these people are deadly sly, that was one of his phrases for them, even though they're very clever, they're very shrewd, there's something defective in their mental equipment. Something that causes them to engage in reality loss, to believe in the world that's coming, even though it's pure fantasy than the world that we actually inhabit. A related theory, a related psychological portrait of violent fanaticism appeared 12 years later by the most famous criminal anthropologist of the 19th century, Cesare Lombroso, in a classic book, still worth reading today, called Criminal Man. It came out in 1876, in which he argued, I, as a Democrat, I, as a socialist, wish that all men were created equal, but they're not. I really wish they were. But the fact of the matter is that some men are born killers. They're born killers. There's something about their physical and psychological makeup that leads them to violence. And Lombroso wrote many books on this theme. He was a hugely influential thinker in his day. He was often called in as an expert witness on criminal trials in the 19th century. Even though the scientific community no longer subscribes to his theories, we still, in our current language, in all European languages, we still have such phrases in our lexicon to the effect that he has the look of a thief. That's Lombrosian. That's Lombrosian language. He has the look of a thief. Or he's a born killer. That's another phrase that he was very fond of using. Getting closer to our own time in the 20th century, the most influential psychological portrait of the violent fanatic unquestionably was written by Eric Hoffer, The True Believer. Many of you I know have read that book. And Hoffer's book is very much in the tradition of the Lucien de la Rode, Lombroso school, that there is a set number of individuals in every society He calls them the congenitally frustrated. The congenitally frustrated. There's a certain percentage in every society that is going to be drawn toward fanaticism, whether it's religious cults or revolutionary movements or terrorist groups. He says in that 1950 book that there are people who come to the point where they believe that their lives are spoiled. Their own individual existences have been spoiled by some agency, whether it's the Zionist state or international capitalism or multinational corporations, whatever it may be, whatever the agency may be. There's a certain percentage of the population that's going to come to the most extreme conclusion about that and say we've got to blow this up. It's the only solution. Piecemeal reform is worthless. There's no way to change the basic structure of the world short of violence, and they find the group that is right for them. Now, the question that I would raise is how useful, how valuable are these trans-historical psychological theories about violent fanatics, about people willing to die for a cause? I would say that they're valuable up to a point. And in fact, when I was doing, Mark mentioned a couple of my books that I've written about terrorism in Italy. That's my research specialty. And in the 80s, when I was doing research on the Red Brigades, which was a Marxist-Leninist left-wing group, and various extreme right-wing neo-fascist terrorist groups, remembering my reading of Eric Hoffer and some of these other theorists, I observed in my research that extreme left-wing people, Marxist-Leninist people, and extreme right-wing neo-fascist people who politically and ideologically have nothing whatsoever in common. They hate each other with a violent, furious passion. And they have a bloody history to prove it in the various ideological civil wars of Europe, about which we know nothing in this country, thank God. But what they do have in common is the psychological bond that Hoffer talks about, that they have much more in common than either group has with the ideological mainstream. The ideological mainstream, most people are content to live lives of quiet desperation and get on with it, pay the mortgage, get the braces for the kids, go to do your job, mow the lawn and all the rest of it, and get through life that way, more or less. But there are individuals who aren't prepared to do that, on the left and the right. So I found those theories helpful in my own research work. But I also quickly discovered how limited those theories are. They don't really get at the full story of terrorism. They hint at it, and they point us in the right direction to a certain extent. But there are problems with these theories, and I'm only going to bother you with two of these problems and get on to my conclusions. The first problem is that I discovered in my own research on the Italian story is that a lot of the people I dealt with, a lot of the people I was doing research on the extreme left and the extreme right, were not marginal personalities at all. They were not congenitally frustrated personalities at all. They were very smart, very well educated, and extremely successful professionally. University professors were deeply involved in the Red Brigade experience. Some of the most talented, heavily published, extremely applauded figures in the Italian academic world were deeply involved in this. You couldn't get at their motives using De La Hode, using Hoffer, or using Lombroso. So what I finally, and then the second problem, and I'll tell you what I finally fell back on, and this will bring me to my conclusions. The second limitation of those theories, and I think this is the more severe of the two, is that if these theorists are right, that that every society produces a certain number of defectives or frustrated or people with malfunctioning mental equipment leading to reality loss. If that's true, then why is it, I asked myself, that some societies, such as Italy and Germany and Ireland and Spain, produce more of these individuals than Scandinavia or Switzerland? Why is that? And why is it that other countries, other areas of the world, such as Latin America and the Middle East and the Balkans, produce many, many more of these individuals? So my own conclusion in my research, and I try to make this argument in my teaching as well, is that terrorism, in my own experience, my own research experience, is much more a matter of trying to understand unhinged societies than unhinged individuals. Unhinged societies rather than unhinged individuals. I think that's a much bigger problem. And it's much closer to getting at the heart of what engenders terrorism in some countries and some places rather than in other countries and other places. And now I'm going to come to my conclusion, because we're still, even after I have told you what my own personal conviction is about the main motor of terrorism, it's a social problem rather than an individual problem, we're still left with Denny's question of what do we do about those individuals? What do we do about them? They're there, and we have to, Dr. Pierce has given you the 5 Ds, and I have no quarrel whatsoever with any of the points that he made. I agree with all of that, but I would add something. And I can't really think of another D, so this is just going to have to come out as it will. And I'll just reduce this part of my talk to a very brief statement about an important book I read a couple of years ago that has really helped me to think more clearly about this problem than I was able to think about it before, about what to do with individual terrorists and terrorist groups. The book is by Amos Elon. He's an Israeli historian, a contemporary historian. And the book is The Blood-Dimmed Tide, Dispatches from the Middle East. Here's what he says, briefly, on our theme. He says that, first of all, he begins this book by castigating radical Islamic terrorism. This is egregious behavior. You can't be blowing up university cafeterias and expect to go anywhere but hell. There's no doubt about this. I mean, he excoriates those groups. But then he adds something that I think is very important for us to know about and to keep in mind. He says, you know, my own people, the Israelis, the Jews, have their own demons. They have their own demons. And it's at this point in his book where he analyzes the career of Rabbi Meir Kahane, Dr. Baruch Goldstein, who killed 30 Islamic worshippers in mosque, Yigal Amir, the assassin of Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister. He says, we have monsters. They're here. And we have a lot more of them. If it were not for the fact that Israel is getting pretty much what it wants from the United States, it's getting the weaponry from the Pentagon, it's getting the money from the United States Treasury, it's getting support in the UN from the United States pretty much down the line. In other words, according to Elon, whose work I think is fearless, I mean, he has platoons of enemies coming after him all the time in Israel. They hate him because he's fearless. And he stares down some of those Likudniks who were leading Israel, in my judgment, in the wrong direction. But in any case, what he says is that we have found a way to deal with Israel in a manner that minimizes the appeal of the most extreme elements. We haven't eliminated them, but we have minimized their appeal. Now, when you compare that treatment with what the Palestinians are getting, when you look at that Palestinian society and you take in the magnitude of the poverty there, the squalor, the degradation, the humiliation, living in the midst of an occupying force endowed with overwhelming firepower, you begin to understand why that is an unhinged society. Now, we know from our study of Nazi Germany, from no other experience in our Western civilization, we know that Germany, with the most magnificent university system in the world, with the best education system on earth, once that society got to a certain level of unemployment, bankruptcy, foreclosure, poverty, and fear, Hitler showed up. The conclusion to be drawn from that historical fact is that when people reach a breaking point psychologically, political pathologies become inevitable. If they were inevitable in the most advanced, enlightened, educated nation on earth in 1933, why do we faint with surprise today when in these Middle Eastern cultures suffering from far worse problems with unemployment and poverty and all of the other negative indicators I've just cited, why do we faint with surprise that pathologies are emerging in those societies in the form of suicide bombers? So my own concluding line would be this. It seems to me, and I will be very eager to get your views on this, it seems to me that for this country to be engaging in a multi-billion-dollar military effort in Iraq while allowing those Palestinian refugee camps to stand as warrens of terrorism is a fool's errand. I'll be eager to get your views on this. Thank you.
I find myself thinking something that sounds like the start of a joke. You know, what do you get if you put a historian of political science and scientist and a philosopher together to deal with the question of terrorism? But it's not a joke. It seems to me that you get some agreement, but very different bases from which to begin to formulate an answer. I'm going to talk about empathy. And it's something that for me connects some with what Dr. Pierce talked about in his last D, dissuasion, and not at all with what Richard talked about in terms of fanaticism and extremism, because I think that when we marginalize people that way, we can't deal with them. And I guess that's the D I'll add to the discussion. And that's that I think we need to think about how to deal with that special group of terrorists that I call homicide bombers rather than suicide bombers. I don't think that we can deal with them until we develop empathy for them. And I don't mean that we need to agree with their tactics or even agree with their underlying cause. Empathy does mean that we need to understand what they do and why they're doing it. It means that we have to start with the presumption that instead of the fact that they're irrational fanaticists, that instead they see their acts as justified rational suicide and justified rational killing of others. I'm using homicide rather than the more common term suicide bombers because it's the intent to kill and damage what is seen as the enemy, which provides the basis for their action and what I think opens the door for our being able to reach the kind of understanding necessary to be able to deal with these folks. Our president told us after 9/11 that the terrorist attack happened because the terrorists hate us because of our freedom. They hate us, he said, for who we are. They hate us for our tolerance. Or homicide bombers are presented as religious fanatics, as Richard talked about, with the kind of built-in irrationality that comes with that. But in current history, I think it's important to remember that there's a lot of secular homicide bombing going on along with religious-based. For example, Sri Lanka at least rivals Israel with more than 170 homicide bombings, mostly by female bombers, in the secular intent of creating a 10-mill nation, cultural. This is a cultural, not a religious act. The problem with thinking of homicide bombers as fanatics or extremists is that we can't empathize with them. Let's see. Would I kill myself and thousands of other people because citizens in other countries have more freedom than I do? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I would sneak out of my country instead. When we start our line of philosophical thinking about terrorism in a way that ends up that it just doesn't make sense, I think that we're all in trouble. In that case, we end up thinking of homicide bombers as crazy, irrational, impossible to understand. And rational people like us don't try to understand, reason with, or reconcile with those who are irrational. So, what I'd like to do is actually start, and it's kind of the middle of this too, but let's talk a little bit about Western moral philosophy. I don't even think we have to talk about Islam here. Western moral philosophy, 2,000 years of us, tells us that one of the things that we have common among us, just as a species, just as rational people, is that we want to avoid certain harms for ourselves and those we love. We want to avoid pain, death, disability, being deprived of pleasure and opportunity. And death is generally seen as the greatest harm. But sometimes wanting death instead of one of these other evils can be justified. Choosing execution over the deprivation of pleasure and opportunity can be a rational choice. At least most philosophers think that it was rational for Socrates to choose hemlock over exile. Closer to our own experience, a terminally ill patient who chooses certain death over horrendous and questionable treatment is certainly acting rationally, even if other patients in the same situation might choose the opposite approach. But choosing to be harmed, such as choosing death with no reason, is what's called irrational. If someone we love tells us that she's decided to commit suicide but has no reason for doing it, we'd give that person help. We wouldn't stand by and let it happen. We'd work to prevent it. And if we continue to think of homicide bombers as irrational, we'll never be able to figure out how we might prevent that act. We make the leap from concern about ourselves and those we love into others through what I call the human analogy. What's irrational to want for oneself is unethical or immoral to cause for another. If it's irrational to want to be caused harm without reason, it's unethical to cause harm without reason. Everyone knows this. And in fact, it's the rational understanding of the human analogy that makes concepts and actions like torture and terrorism possible. The only way I can cause you pain or terror is by thinking that you're like me and you want to avoid those harms. But just as there are justified exceptions for wanting oneself to die, there are justified exceptions to causing death to other people. Many people argue that physician-assisted suicide is an example of this for terminally ill patients. Others believe that it's morally permitted to perform an operation that will save the life of a pregnant woman, even if it means that her fetus will certainly die in the process. People who believe in capital punishment think that it's justified for the state to put certain criminals to death. People who believe in war argue that it's justified to cause the death of combatants who are on the other side. And war brings us back to the rational suicide part of this equation. When our soldiers give up their lives for their country, we award them medals and we call them courageous. Even the philosopher Immanuel Kant, again just sticking in the Western, solid tradition of Western philosophy, and Kant would say it's not justified for a terminally ill patient to choose suicide. But Kant would allow for rational suicide, or rather homicide, on the battleground. That leads to one step. Kant says, the sovereign can call up his subjects to fight for the death of their country, and those who fall on the field of battle are not suicides, but victims of fate. Not only is this not suicide, but the opposite. For a faint heart and the fear of death, which threatens by the necessity of fate, is no true self-preservation. So if you shy away from that, that's not a good thing. For he who runs away to save his own life and leaves his comrades in the lurch is a coward. But he who defends himself and his fellows, even unto death, is no suicide, but noble and high-minded. For life is not to be highly regarded for its own sake. He says, if I cannot preserve my life except by violating duties to myself, I'm bound to sacrifice my life rather than violate those duties. Cowardice is a violation of duties toward oneself. Dishonoring oneself counts as a violation. So where does Western philosophy then take us if we begin with the understanding that homicide bombers believe that they're acting in rational, justified ways? I think it takes us to a place that we can begin to accept that these are acts of people who are desperate and hopeless and frustrated rather than crazy and vicious. By the way, it's not easy to find examples of justification for homicide bombers. I mean, if you enter suicide bomber and justification in Google, you go through 6 pages of how insane the act is before you can begin to find examples of people who are working to open the window that allows us to develop empathy. One of those writers is a Master of Public Policy candidate at the University of Chicago, a guy named Ian Cook. And Cook provides a start. I'll just read a couple of things to you about this, and then we'll start talking. Cook says, examining profiles of failed suicide bombers makes it possible to glimpse the condition of the individual prior to the ultimately failed explosion. These people often express not only an absence of fear at that moment when they thought they were about to blow themselves and everything else up, but also an excitement of the impending attack. During this period, failed bombers have expressed a sense of elation that can only be interpreted as utility from the impending death of others. That is, the bomber has good reason to believe that their grievance has been addressed, that the enemy will suffer. The expected gains from the action have incited the individual to undertake the event, and carrying out the bomb is the actual gratification, the actual event itself. He says personal acts of martyrdom are intimately tied with occasions of personal loss and tragedy. Even those who organized the ranks, the recruiting group that has been talked about, of would-be homicide bombers, tout the strength of this tactic to maximize damage to the enemy. It's about the other. It's not about blowing oneself up. The strikes, according to the words of a terrorist leader, are a way of engaging the individual in killing the enemies of God or the enemies of his country. I'll end with the description Cook provides of a woman volunteer, homicide bomber named Suha. Recently accepted into a martyrs brigade in Palestine, Suha tells an interviewer that she thinks not about the explosive belt, but about the blow she will strike against Israel. Young and moderately educated, she has been a resident of Palestinian territories for her entire life. She believes, quote, even if I have children, there's no life or future. As part of her justification for becoming a homicide bomber, Suha mentions the daily humiliation Palestinians endure because of Israelis and cites the Israeli strike against the Jenin refugee camp as the point where she decided to volunteer for the mission. Now, when I talk about developing empathy, I'm not saying that empathy allows us or takes us to a place where we agree that the terrorists are right. I think it takes us to a place that we can begin to figure out how we can, to use Al's words, dissuade.
Thank you, Denny, and thanks to all the panelists. I'd like to remind you that if you do have questions, you can write them down on a card and pass them to the aisle, and we'll begin to take those. I'd just like to, invite, first of all, to see if any of the speakers for the evening have a pressing response to any of each other's remarks you'd like to begin.
Let me make, if I can, 2 quick comments, one on Professor Drake's and then one on Denny's. I think that it was useful to hear you walk through both unhinged personalities and unhinged societies. I think that, my own take on that as I was listening to you was it's not an either or.
Right.
That it's possible that we should pay attention to both. Second, on Denny, I could not agree more. That I think it is particularly inaccurate and therefore unuseful to describe much of this behavior as irrational. I think we have to make an effort to try to understand the rationality behind it. because if we can't understand why they're doing it, we can't dissuade other people from taking a similar course of action. So I'm completely in accord with what you said on that, and I really do appreciate the delineation of the unhinged personality and the unhinged society.
I have a quick question. I wonder, Denny and Dr. Pierce, how you two would reconcile Denny's appeal for an empathic understanding of terrorism and your insistence that delegitimization has to be one of the Ds in our crusade against it. Isn't there a conflict there that cannot be resolved?
Oh, no, you first.
You have better voice left than I do. I don't think there's a necessary contradiction. I think they can bump up against each other. I don't think, and I'd be interested in what Denny thinks, I don't think that empathy and delegitimization are necessarily inconsistent with each other. I think we may understand the motivations of people as a tool to help us delegitimize them. If what I understand from some of my Islamic colleagues is that Islam does condemn suicide, then I think understanding the motivations of people who might commit suicide while committing homicide is helpful. But until we take that next step and delegitimize that, just because they feel that way is not going to dissuade them from doing that. I think we need other tools and other devices to sort of walk that cat backwards, if you will.
I guess I just would like to make a point about justice. And again, I mean, Kant's not always my favorite philosopher, but tonight he seems to be. Kant makes a point about benevolence that I think is particularly nice. Kant doesn't think that benevolence is something that we do out of the goodness of our hearts. Kant says that it's only an accident of birth that some people are born with wealth and some people are born in poverty. It's the community, the world community, that allows for some people to live in horrible situations. It's the same world community that allows us to live with the richness that we have. And Kant argues that therefore we have a debt. We have an obligation to change the world community so that it's not so unbalanced. And in a way, Al, I am responding to your point, because delegitimizing terrorism is something that is a rational act for any nation state. Because one of the things that non-sanctioned combatants, that is terrorists, do is they take away the power of a government to protect its people, and which is the sort of primary basis for the social contract. I mean, it's necessary for nation states to delegitimize terrorists. But I think that we need to kind of get under that sort of government structure and take a look at the people and ask ourselves, what is it that we as a world community owe to these people who are in such desperate states?
Of course, your initial remarks got everybody thinking quickly whether they could come up with more Ds. And,
I came up with it.
Your name isn't there.
And Denny added an E, empathy, so working our way through the alphabet.
We need to come up with an F. What's not? I was thinking about, given, I think, Professor Drake's remark about this sort of historical ubiquity of this element of those who are willing to die and to kill for causes and fanaticism, it seems to me one of the most important Ds that we have to deal with to be able to make any progress is demilitarize. And because it seems to me what we have, what's different now, and I don't know whether, Professor Drake, you would notice some additional differences, but one of the things that's different, of course, is the technology and availability to those who are now on the edges and undertaking these kinds of acts. And of course, the accessibility of that and the proliferation of that is certainly a major problem. But I think to demilitarize is not only to, of course, inhibit the spread of weapons into the hands of those who would take action, but also to, would it also be an obligation, in essence, to somehow find responses to these populations that is not military at all, in the sense, and does our effort, and I guess this would be a question I'd start first to you, Al, does our effort to succeed, that is defeat militarily, isn't that counterproductive in the sense that it militarizes the relationships that we have?
There's a lot wrapped up in what you just said. Let me try to tackle a couple pieces of it. I think, I'm not quite sure what you mean by demilitarize. I think reducing the likelihood that weapons of mass destruction can get in the hands of destructive people is good. Whether that is demilitarizing or whether that is all of the demilitarization you had in mind. I don't think at a time when societies, whether it's Israel or the United States or others, are under assault, it's counterintuitive, I think, to some extent to argue, and certainly politically unpopular to argue for demilitarization, because the first obligation of the government is to defend, and militaries are a principal line of defense. So I would see that reducing the likelihood that weapons of mass destruction can get in the hands of terrorists is a useful step. But I would point out that September 11, 2001 involved essentially nothing military. 19 people, most of whom were well-educated members of the professional class, not the dispossessed, not the wretched of the earth, who were highly skilled members of, if not elites, then the functional equivalent of upper middle class in their societies, took over commercial airliners loaded with jet fuel and crashed them into buildings. There was absolutely nothing military about what they did. That doesn't mean that other terrorists did not use weapons to do this. So demilitarization alone, it seems to me, doesn't solve the problem, because they could have just as well crashed airplanes into a nuclear power plant or a major electrical switching facility, so on and so forth, and wreaked havoc. So I'm not sure that demilitarization is the principal path that I would go down. And I say that not just because of where I work, but I think that there is a legitimate role for military forces to defend. And I said in the earlier session today, I would like us to pay much more attention to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction than perhaps we're doing right now.
Additional comment? No?
Fine.
I had a question from the audience about motivating or building empathy. And the author says, consider how Israeli and U.S. and American governments would deal or be forced to deal with Palestinian activists committing public acts of suicide rather than homicide. If terrorists are trying to get us to listen, how about a change in tactics?
As you were reading that question, or reading from that question, the image that immediately came to my mind was that of Vietnamese monks immolating themselves during Vietnam. They were committing suicide, not homicide, and those are, I think for people of my generation, among the most poignant images of Vietnam. So there is precedent for people doing that. In fact, there was then, and probably still is now, very little that anyone can do to prevent individuals from doing that.
Well, I think, and this, again, I think might have to do, well, it might have to do with sort of the different disciplinary bases from where we start our thinking about this, or it might just have to do with, pacifism versus other things. But it seems to me that public acts of suicide, such as the ones that you talked about, are a step toward the homicide bombings that we have today, and that there better be a way of preventing it in terms of understanding the human conditions that drive people to those paths.
That was your question, Benny. I defer to you.
We have a question, I think, here about this issue of dissuading that I think brings together your comments as well. I think your comments about dissuading is one of the Ds, and then I think the capacity to enter into some kind of an understanding of what motivates these people was central to Denny's remark. And that the question is, I guess, first to Al to speak more about the issue of dissuading. If I understood, we need to dissuade others from their attitudes about us. How do we do that? And why should these others change their attitude if they believe our culture and values to be evil? I mean, I think there's also this sense in which, as the philosopher Alistair McIntyre said, whose justice, which rationality? We're really talking about very different kinds of rationalities here. And how do we engage in that process of dissuasion, or how do we engage in that process of empathy when they are so different?
This is where I think Denny and I are pretty much in harmony on this point, because I think empathy is the starting point for any dissuasion or persuasion campaign. Years ago, when I was living in Boston, an Irish Catholic Democratic political operative told me, he was a son of the labor movement, said the best labor negotiators were those who could think like management. It didn't mean they agreed with management, but they could think like management. They could look at reality and look at problems through management's eyes. And so I think the ability to put yourself in someone else's position is the starting point. This also overlaps, I think, with your the earlier question about demilitarization, because I think in the dissuasion D, military means are not useful at all. In fact, they're probably counterproductive. And there may be some tension in the way we go about the defeating that there may be some aspects of the way we go about defeating that could be counterproductive there, and we need to balance those two. And that's why I said the art is in the mix of the 5 Ds. But if I had the answer to your direct question, how do we do that? I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be sitting in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and having dinner in the White House mess. So I don't have any sort of simple formula for that. I think it's important as we think about it, and one of the points I should have made about my 3 circles. My guess, my impression is that there is essentially no dissuasion to be done with the people who are in the middle circle. They're already there. Their positions are the product of reflective behavior, personal experience, societal experience. They're there. And I think those are the people we have to defend against and defeat. In that middle circle, the amateurs, if you will, I think there's room to dissuade, and you start in that larger circle, the pool from which they get recruited. And even in that larger pool, I think there is quite a spectrum of people. There are some who have maybe particular grievances about us, the way we operate in the world, the nature of our society, our culture, that would be open to some kind of dialogue and dissuasion, dialogue and persuasion. Maybe we're not as bad as they think we are. I think there are probably some in that circle who are also too far gone. They can't all be dissuaded. So I think we have to sort of disassemble the people in that outer circle and try to deal with different groups who have different motivations. For some, if you just take the literature at face value, there are some who say for whom the critical issue is the presence of U.S. forces in Saudi Arabia, the location of the 2 holiest sites in Islam. There are others who, if you take them at face value, are deeply offended by the existence of golden arches in their country. It's probably easier to do something about the former than it is about the latter. And I think we're really going to have to disaggregate the people in that outer circle and dissuade and find what motivates individuals, because I think there's a mix and a variety of motivations there. And that's why I say that the realm of dissuasion is the art of policy and of public diplomacy. It doesn't mean caving in to demands made by this, that, and the other, because then we would have a hollow existence. But I think where we can meet them on common ground, it's to our advantage to do so.
On the issue of dissuasion, I wonder if we are doing enough as a people about the problem of poverty in the world as a spur to pathological political behavior. I mean, the author who has influenced me the most deeply on these themes tonight is Dostoevsky. The book of his that I think is the most profound is his work on terrorism, on the Narodnaya Volya, the book he wrote in the early 1870s called The Possessed. And in that book, he said that evil exists in the world. There's no doubt about this, certainly not for a Christian. Evil is real, and it is omnipresent. And the question is, how do we defeat it? And one of the things that we have to recognize is our own flaw, our own failure to act morally, to act responsibly, and what contribution are we in our smugness making as a nation? I think our responsibility for these problems is huge and unacknowledged. And this is the unannounced, unexamined story about terrorism in the American media, in my view. We need to reread or possibly just read Dostoevsky. He will grab you by the scruff of the neck and shake you until you're mortally wounded, unless you pay attention to him. Anyway, that's my thought on persuasion.
You persuaded.
Okay.
Well, we're getting a number of comments here sort of related to the idea of, the effectiveness of military as a part of the strategy. And I think, Dr. Pierce, you made some, effective points about the fact that it's one of 5 points, that there's a certain kind of coordination in those points that has to be done in order to be successful in response. I think part of what I'm seeing is, and thinking about here is the way in which military activity seems to be in some ways counterproductive, at least in terms of the war in Iraq. The question was, is it going to confront terrorism or is it going to breed terrorism? And I think we had a question of whether is a military an effective method for winning a war in which a victory can also only be achieved by convincing the other side not to fight. And so I think the issue has to be, what is the balance here? If you are talking about that it really does involve a mix there, and maybe all 3 of you would have some brief comments on perhaps the degree of weighting of your Ds.
I don't think there's a single simple answer to what's the proper weighting. This isn't mathematics. There's no equation that's going to tell us how to do this. This is the art of statecraft. And the balance will probably change over time. But I do believe that the comment I made at the end, that we ignore any one of those Ds at our peril. Now, we may have to have a different mix of the Ds in dealing with Afghanistan than we do with Iraq, than we do with Saudi Arabia, than we do with Pakistan, than we do with the Israeli-Palestinian situation. So there's no single simple answer to what's the weighting of those. And you're right, and it goes back to your earlier question. I think there certainly are ways in which one of the Ds can work against another of them. And one of those examples is there are ways in which we could use military force that would be counterproductive to our efforts to dissuade, to be sure. But at the same time, and I'm trying to pick up on something you just said about ways to persuade people not to fight. I mean, the history of warfare, one of the things I think it indicates is that in the cases of surrender, it is far more often than not A's use of military power that persuades B that it's in B's interest to give up fighting. That the costs of continuing the war would be greater than the gains to be had by it. If I'm thinking of a historical example, it might be the French surrender in June of 1940, making the case that in fact, Pétain says, we fought the Germans in France in 1870, 1871. That didn't turn out very well. We fought them in France in 1914 to 1918. It didn't turn out so well. So maybe we ought to stop fighting them now when we're already losing very, very rapidly in this war. So I think, again, there's no single answer to there's no formula that tells you how to mix them. We're going to have to change it from country to country. We're going to have to change it over time. And the mix of the 5Ds in Iraq today ought to be different than the mix in the 5Ds in Iraq a year ago. And it ought to be different than the mix of the 5Ds in Iraq a year from now.
Ken?
I think that the war on terror, which always seems to me to be a very funny construction in itself, is something different from the traditional understanding that we have of war between nation states. And the idea of a stronger country being able to persuade a weaker country to give up its arms, I think exists in a different kind of world than where we have non-state sanctioned combatants, that is terrorists, who are multi-funded, who don't quite fit in a way that is a legitimate government fighting a legitimate government with state-sanctioned combatants, and somebody's got more firepower and they win. I think that that when we've got terrorists taking on innocent civilians, taking on governments in the way that they are, that we have a special need to find alternatives to meeting violence with violence. And that's, again, where I think the empathy idea comes in, is that the more we can marginalize the other and make it something different from us, the easier it is to try to persuade ourselves that we can just kill them and then go on our merry way. And I think that's not possible anymore.
When the United States government made it clear that it wanted to go to war in Iraq, many of our friends in Europe, particularly the French and the Germans, opposed us. And they presented numerous arguments about why we should not do that. The most powerful of these arguments, in my view, was that, look, we as NATO allies are fighting terrorism in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda and related organizations. We should fight that war until we win it. We have not won it. We have not captured Osama bin Laden. This organization is still extant, it is still dangerous, and we should pursue the policies that we have pursued up till now until they are completely successful. Now, I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I was embarrassed for my country when I listened to some of the responses to the Germans and to the French. I'll tell you why I was embarrassed. Because even if you disagreed with the Germans and the French in their resistance, they were making a serious argument. And not only were they making a serious argument that deserved to be met on the field of debate seriously, not with jokes on the late-night television programs and with scurrilous remarks about French virility and German honor, but with serious historical, political, geopolitical arguments. And it seems to me that we had an additional reason to take these people seriously. They have been our friends and our allies for decades now in NATO. This organization has served its purposes very well. We constructed these multilateral arrangements, which we then quite gleefully were prepared to ignore and indeed to damage, I hope not irreparably. And so, when I think about the war in Iraq, I think about whether or not our real long-range interests are being served. It seems to me that the people who killed our citizens, namely Al-Qaeda, are our real and immediate enemies, and they should be targeted. I'm much less charitable than Denny is about developing empathy for them. I think that that one does want to understand what motivates them, but there's no doubt about their sworn vengeance against the United States. My only concern about them is trying to figure out ways to keep the greater Islamic society from being drawn to them. You see, I've listened to Dr. Pierce's description of these circles that he sees as a way to explain terrorism, and I really see two circles, not the three that he sees. I see two. I see the greater society circle, and then I see a smaller circle in the middle of that society. And let's say for the case of radical Islam, the Al-Qaeda circle is there. And the question I ask to myself is, how can I shrink that circle, the little one, to the vanishing point? How can I do that? Now, can I do that by going to war in Iraq and bringing democracy through a shock and awe strategy, which is not how we obtain democracy? And anybody who's remotely familiar with the great conservative democratic theorists, Edmund Burke, Thomas Carlyle, knows that this is not the way to plant the seeds of a genuine democratic culture that will, in the long run, yield the harvest we desperately need for the world. So on the whole question of the war in Iraq, I think it's a mistake. I think that the real problems that gave rise to Al-Qaeda remain, and the war in Iraq does not address them. It addresses other problems, and they may very well be as serious as the administration tells us that they are. But I don't think that the problem that we're addressing tonight is going to be affected in the way we want it to be affected by this strategy. So that's my response to that.
I want to pick up, if I may, on a point that Denny made, and I agree with you there too. I think it is not particularly useful to think or talk about a war on terrorism or a war against terrorism. I mean, terrorism is a tactic. It's a technique. On December 8, 1941, Franklin Roosevelt did not ask the Congress to declare war on air power. He asked the Congress to declare war on the Empire of Japan, which had used air power to attack us. So I don't find it particularly useful to have a war on terrorism, although it's probably more useful than a war against evil, despite all the limitations of a war against terrorism. At the same time, however, while I subscribe to your approach on empathy for those we are trying to dissuade, I think we have to take a moral stance that says intentional attacks on non-combatants are always wrong, no matter who does it, no matter what the provocation, no matter what the cause, no matter what name you address God by in the morning when you start your day. It is always wrong to intentionally attack non-combatants. So there's latitude for me for empathy, for the dissuasion, but that doesn't detract from what I think ought to be an ironclad moral stance, that some things are always wrong no matter what your motivation is, or no matter the particulars of your personal psychology or your societal state.
I couldn't agree more. It's intentional attacks on non-combatants are always wrong, whether it's in Hiroshima or Baghdad.
We're close to the end of our time, and I have several questions I wasn't able to get to. I'm wondering if anyone would like to assume the initiative and approach the microphone with the final one or two questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
I asked the question as a person not involved in academia. I'm a 1969 Vietnam veteran, 25th Infantry Division, Forward Infantry Camp, MASH Medical Unit. Ron Starr for doing nothing but just being a soldier there. With an MA in Religious Ethics from the School in Berkeley in 1975. And with a front page newspaper a few days ago, friend of 40 years, high school college classmate, who's just been called up as a 56-year-old high school teacher. He's retiring, he's being called up, perhaps going to Iraq. My question is, all of this discussion in varying degrees tends to look outward toward them, or empathy out toward them. how we dissuade or do whatever. What about looking backwards toward us, toward me, toward Colonel Tibbets, the Enola Gay pilot, toward the person that drove the train in Nazi Germany to the death camps? Their personal responsibility, independent of and separate from society's support of them doing that. You know, you've got Lieutenant Cowley, but you've got Colonel Tibbets. You know, one we prosecute, one, I don't know if we call a hero, but we say ended the war and saved 1 million lives. I am a person that took individual actions, no matter how much my society, my country, my church, or anything supported me in doing my part there. Am I not still personally responsible, independent from that? And I think in terms of ethics in the military academy, are the naval cadets and others taught, I don't think I was in the military, are they taught that they're personally responsible, personally, the rest of their moral life, even if the society supports them fully?
Yes. One of the things that we try to teach, and I think probably the aftermath of Vietnam was an impetus to the teaching of ethics in the U.S. military and professional education system. You cited Lieutenant Cowley, who was perpetrating the massacre at My Lai. We just had, 2 weeks ago, we sponsored our major fall lecture, and we had Hugh Thompson come, who was the helicopter pilot who stopped the My Lai massacre in progress. And it's a powerful message for 19, 20, 21, 22-year-old midshipmen that you may have to take a stance against your institution or against a localized part of your institution that is there and stand up for what you think is right. The part that has always fascinated me about, and I said this to someone earlier today, I think, that always fascinated me about My Lai is if you look at Lieutenant Rusty Cowley, whose platoon was perpetrating the massacre, and he personally was doing some of the killing, and you look at Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, who stopped it, neither of them were the beneficiaries of the kind of education that the students in this room got. Hugh Thompson describes himself as, I was just a country boy who liked flying helicopters. If you rack up their backgrounds, they were 2 peas in a pod, yet on the same morning, one of them said, kill them all. And the other one said, this is wrong, we're going to stop it. And Hugh Thompson lands his helicopter between Cowley's platoon and some Vietnamese civilians who had hid in a bunker. And Hugh Thompson tells his 19-year-old tail gunner, if the Americans open up fire on the Vietnamese again, you open up fire on the Americans. Now, Hugh Thompson knew that what would be the outcome of a firefight between his 3-man crew and a 40-member infantry platoon. And what impelled him to do that? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. He never took a philosophy course. He never took an ethics course. There's something about moral intuition which Denny can explain to us more effectively than I can. But nonetheless, we tried to use those as moral exemplars. Always qualified with, I hope to God this never happens to you, but if it does, I say this to young midshipmen, I don't want the first time you to think about this issue is when it happens to you. That's why we have schools. That's why we have classrooms and case studies and films to give people practice in moral reasoning, which I think what the Practical Ethics Center here is all about. We always say that you exercise your physical muscles in the military in peacetime so that you can do the job on the battlefield in wartime. That's true of exercising your ethical muscles as well. And it's the great luxury of classrooms and seminars so that you will have the wherewithal to make those choices when you get out. So your comments about personal responsibility are music to my ears, and they're central to what we're trying to do. So I appreciate your making those points here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. And this was an apt way to, I think, pull together the comments for the evening. Would you or any of the others have any final comments you'd want to offer before we wrap it up here?
Lacking voice, I will not make any comments.
I also just want to draw your attention to a couple other items. There will be a community forum sponsored by the United Nations Foundation on Wednesday, this Wednesday at 7 o'clock at the Urey Lecture Hall on the National Security Strategy Policy of the United States, Preemptive War as Strategy. Again, that's Wednesday at 7. And also Thursday, December 4th, Professor Drake will speak at an International Brown Bag series. His talk is called Terrorism, New Threats and Old, and that's from 12 to 1 at the UC Ballroom. For those of you interested in continuing to think about this important topic. So I want to again first of all, thank you all for attending and participating in the forum, and please join me in thanking our panelists.